Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some very important news to discuss out of the state of Georgia, which is that Republican Representative and very strong Trump ally Mike Collins officially launches his campaign to run for Senate in 2026 against the Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. Now, Mike Collins, who you may or may not be familiar with, in Georgia is a United States representative. And Mike Collins represents this district, the Georgia 10th district, right here. It is a pretty reliable, safe Republican district, and he is currently saying he wants to run for Senate in the state against Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. So just to give you some backstory on this race if you're unfamiliar, the Democrat Jon Ossoff first ran for U.S. Senate in Georgia in 2020. And Jon Ossoff defeated the Republican Senator David Perdue in a runoff election after he initially lost in the first round of voting on Election Day in November of 2020. But in Georgia, you must break 50% of the vote to win the Senate election, and David Perdue did not do that. So it ended up going to a runoff election on January 5th, 2021, where Jon Ossoff ended up getting 50.6% of the vote. David Perdue only got 49.39% of the vote. So Jon Ossoff, who's also a candidate in a special election for Georgia's 6th congressional district in 2017, you may remember that election. Jon Ossoff has had a pretty well-known political history in Georgia, despite it not actually being that much of a long time being in the state in terms of actual elected history. So that special election, or that election in 2017, the special election runoff, showed the Republican Karen Handel winning with 51.8% to Jon Ossoff's 48.2%. Now that was very, very close. And just to give you an idea of what this district currently is, the 6th congressional district, and we go down to Georgia here, the 6th district, which you're going to find right here, I believe, here it is, Lucy McBath, this district, it was redrawn. It was actually a 22 or 25 point Democratic district. Now you have to go back to 2016 or so in this district. This district was actually, let me find it here. Here it is, a pretty reliable, safe Republican win of 23.4% Republican win. And then in 2018, the Democrat Lucy McBath won against the Republican Karen Handel by about 1 point. So this district moved a lot to the Democratic side in that special election than the general election in 2018. So Jon Ossoff, after that impressive showing in 2017 in that special election, then decides to run for Senate in 2020 against the Republican Senator David Perdue. And he won a very contested Democratic primary where he got a clear majority of the vote and faced off in the general election. And as I mentioned, initially on Election Day, technically David Perdue got more votes, and you could argue and quote-unquote kinda won against Jon Ossoff. But in Georgia, the winning candidate for Senate must break 50% of the vote. So even though David Perdue got 49.7% and got more votes than Jon Ossoff, David Perdue did not actually win because he did not break 50%. And a big reason being in this race, you could argue, was the Libertarian third-party candidate Shane Hazel, who got 2.3% of the vote. If those 115,039 votes had to choose between Perdue and Ossoff and did not have a third choice, it's possible David Perdue would have actually won this race outright on Election Day. But that does not happen. Goes to a runoff between Perdue and Ossoff, and then Ossoff is the one that ends up winning 50.6 to 49.4. So only a 1.2% margin of victory for Ossoff over Perdue in the runoff election in 2020. If you want to do the rough math here, this ends up translating to roughly about 55,000 votes or so, separating Ossoff and Perdue in Georgia. Now, 6 years later, this race is going to be up again in 2026. And this is immediately one of the top targets for the Republicans at trying to flip a Democratic Senate seat. However, it has not gone entirely smoothly for the Republicans thus far. The Democrats with Jon Ossoff, obviously Ossoff's the incumbent U.S. Senator. He's going to be running again. He also has raised a lot of money and is fighting for a tough general election. The Republicans had an A-plus potential candidate they could have run in governor of the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp. It made a ton of sense. He's well-liked in the state, holds very high approval ratings, and he is term limited up in the 2026 elections. He cannot run for a third consecutive term. So if Kemp were to run, this would give the Republicans perhaps their strongest challenger candidate in 2026, kind of on par with Roy Cooper for the Democrats in North Carolina. But Brian Kemp decides he does not want to run for this race. And it really hurts the Republicans' chances at flipping this race. Because when you looked at the hypothetical polling early on, Brian Kemp, not only was he one of the best Republicans at actually beating Jon Ossoff, he was beating Jon Ossoff in every single poll, which given 3 out of the 4 were Republican pollsters, and the one poll from the non-Republican pollster was within the margin of error for Ossoff and Kemp in a tied race, essentially. Kemp was leading, albeit narrowly, over Jon Ossoff. It doesn't mean 100% that that would have stayed throughout the campaign and that Ossoff couldn't have defeated Kemp, but Kemp started out with a much higher floor of support than a lot of these other Republican challengers. But with Kemp not running now, the Republicans have to find a Republican candidate to run against Ossoff and likely will not have as strong of a chance to win as Brian Kemp would. Now the Republicans, though, are looking for that person. Reagan Boggs, a horse trainer, and Buddy Carter, U.S. Representative, are in this race, and so far they've not really made too much noise. Now another Republican just dropped out, John King, the Georgia Insurance Commissioner. He's more of an ally of Governor Brian Kemp. Kemp decided he would not be endorsing him. I'll be getting to that in 1 second. But Mike Collins, who has joined this race, is a very close ally of President Trump. And of the Republican candidates in the race, or expected to be in the race so far, if I had to make a guess, I would say Mike Collins is the one who's the most likely to get the endorsement of the president. Now, Derek Dooley, the former head coach of the Tennessee Volunteers football team, is the candidate that, based on reports, Governor Kemp is most interested in endorsing, and when he joins the race, likely will be receiving the endorsement of Governor Kemp when he does enter. This could set up a little bit of a Republican primary proxy war between Governor Kemp and President Trump, who seem to have mended things a little bit during the 2024 and after the 2024 election. Now, maybe a little bit reopening up that feud between Trump and Kemp in this Republican primary if Trump does endorse Collins and Dooley gets the endorsement of Kemp. Now, obviously, there hasn't been much approval or a Republican primary poll of that matchup being the case, seeing as Dooley just made recent news in the last week or so, and same with Mike Collins entering this race. But given it's likely Collins will get the endorsement from Trump, which I think is going to happen, and Dooley will get the endorsement of Kemp, I would imagine to become a two-way race between those two for who becomes the Republican nominee. But even then, regardless of which one gets it, it's not by any means a guarantee the Republicans are going to win. Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, Sabbath Crystal Ball have this race listed as a toss-up, but in the early polling thus far, Jon Ossoff has led over Mike Collins in the Signal Republican poll 46-43, and in the Trafalgar Group poll. Trafalgar is a very top Republican pollster that's been allied with President Trump throughout a lot of 2024, one of his top pollsters. Ossoff is leading over Mike Collins here 48-43, with 3% choosing other and 6% undecided. Now, I would expect come Election Day 2026, Mike Collins would get a lot more than 43% of the vote in this race, but it's possible if these results hold up with that 6% undecided. If you were just to split that 6% up evenly for Ossoff and Collins, give them both 3%, that would get Jon Ossoff over that 50% number, likely on election night 2026, and not even needing a runoff election, which honestly I think the runoff may be the only chance the Republicans have at winning this race. Otherwise, I think Jon Ossoff will probably win on election night. But for Derek Dooley, in the one poll that was included from Signal, it's not really much better. Jon Ossoff had 50% outright, Derek Dooley had 41%, with 9% undecided. So in that scenario, Jon Ossoff already technically breaks 50%, and he would win outright on election day as well. Now, obviously, we're very early on in the 2026 midterm election process. This could all totally change. One or two good polls for Mike Collins or Derek Dooley or one of the other Republicans could totally shift this race and the mood of this race. But right now, it looks like Jon Ossoff's in a very strong position for re-election in 2026. When you look at the results from 2020 and some very key areas here, a large reason, first let's look at the presidential side so I can get the counting results here. In 2020, a large reason Joe Biden was able to win was the strength he had in both Fulton County, where Atlanta is, and the surrounding areas of Cobb County, Douglas County, Clayton, Henry, Rockdale, Newton, DeKalb, and Gwinnett. Just to give you an idea of how these states looked here, we're going to look at 2020 and we're going to compare it to 2024. These counties, even though Fulton County trended red, DeKalb and Gwinnett trended red from 2020 to 2024, Cobb trended blue, Douglas trended blue, you also saw Henry and Rockdale trend blue. Now let's go from 2020 to 2016, and this is where things get really striking. we saw Fulton move 5 points for Biden. Cobb County, 12 points. Douglas, 14. Fayette, 12.5. Clayton, 0.29. DeKalb, 3.9. Gwinnett, 12.4. Forsyth, 14. And again, from 2020 to 2024, except for Fulton, Clayton, and DeKalb, and Gwinnett, which did trend back towards President Trump, Cobb, Douglas, we also see Henry here in Fayette, also did trend a little bit towards the Democratic side still, even though they massively trended from 2016 to 2020 towards the Democratic side. Now we can look at it from 2012 from Mitt Romney to 2024 with President Trump, and this is where things could get a bit concerning. Fulton County from 2012 to 2024 shifted 15 points towards the Democratic side. Cobb County shifted 27 points. Douglas, 27.5. Fayette, 28. Clayton has trended towards Trump by 0.86. DeKalb's trended 8. And Gwinnett, 25. Hall, Forsyth, 29.7. So from 2012 to 2024, they've shifted a lot to the Democratic side. 2016, we've seen Cobb move 12.7. Fulton's move 3.3. DeKalb, 1.2. Gwinnett, 10.7. Forsyth, 14.1. The areas in Atlanta and surrounding Atlanta, for the most part over the last 10 years, have shifted towards the Democratic side. And this is a key area to watch for in the margins for the Senate race in 2026. Because you're going to look here, when Donald Trump won the state of Georgia in 2024, he won it by 2.2%. When Joe Biden won it by 0.24% in 2020, look at the margins in these areas. It's 46.5 in Fulton. This is a big Democratic area. What is Jon Ossoff able to do in 2026? Can he match Joe Biden's numbers here? Can he exceed on them? He exceeded Joe Biden's numbers, albeit a little bit in the runoff election. Can Ossoff do that again in 2026? Cobb County, a 14.3% win for Biden. Does Ossoff expand on that? Douglas, 25. Clayton, 70. DeKalb, 67.4. Gwinnett, 18.2. These are margins that you're seeing here. Jon Ossoff, in most cases, did better than Joe Biden did in these areas. But can Jon Ossoff expand on these numbers and his own numbers from 2020 and 2026, or will it be a similar result to what President Trump ended up doing in 2024, where these margins were a lot more favorable? Fulton was still 45 points, but Cobb was 14.9, Douglas 31.5. Clayton was 69.2, DeKalb 64.8, Gwinnett 16.5. Does Ossoff replicate these margins? That's going to be the question to watch for 2026. And look, for 2026 for the Senate map, Georgia plays a very important role. The Republicans in my current forecast have 52 Senate seats favored to go their way. Democrats currently have 45. Georgia is one of 3 Senate races I currently have in the toss-up no rating category, along with Michigan and North Carolina. And the Democrats are holding 2 of these seats in Michigan and Georgia. Republicans are holding 1 in North Carolina. Now, these races are all going to be very close, and I can see both parties conceivably winning these races. But at this current point in time, right now, I think it very narrowly does not win on election night and goes to a runoff election, at that point where I think Jon Ossoff will end up winning by around a lean Democratic margin. But if the Democrats and Jon Ossoff are not able to win in Georgia in 2026 for some reason, and the Republicans are able to win the Senate race, well, what does that mean? That likely means the massive Democratic wave that Democrats were expecting for 2026 is not coming to fruition if Jon Ossoff is losing. Georgia is a competitive toss-up state. It was very close in 2024. It was very close in 2020. And it's going to be a state that will remain a toss-up state probably for the next few elections for a while now. But even though the track record of it has been a lean Republican state or a likely Republican state, Democrats and Jon Ossoff should win this race in 2026, especially after 2022, where we saw Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate, lose the Democratic incumbent Raphael Warnock in a runoff election by about 2.8%. Now, on that election, the first round of voting, Warnock got 49.44%, Walker got 48.49%. So if Mike Collins or whoever the Republican ends up being can perform better than Herschel Walker on election day, maybe break 49%, maybe they have a stronger chance at winning against Ossoff than Herschel Walker did. But it needs to be worth noting, 2022 was a lot more of a Republican-friendly midterm election environment than 2026 is supposed to be. So if Republicans win in Georgia, that likely means Republicans are probably winning in Michigan, and they're probably going to be narrowly holding North Carolina as well. And then maybe they have a chance of putting a state like New Hampshire in play. But it's also possible that if Jon Ossoff holds on and wins Georgia, he could also do so by a margin of 3.5% to 4% or so. Maybe that's indicative of the Democrats having a very good night where the Democrats are winning Georgia, winning North Carolina, and winning Michigan. That gives the Democrats very important wins, getting them up to 48 Senate seats. And then maybe a state like Maine is in play in that scenario. So Georgia on its own is a very important Senate race and one to watch for 2026. But how it ends up going and what the results end up being could also be indicative of how 2026 election night may go. Because also don't forget, Georgia's polls close some of the earliest in the night. Their polls close at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Georgia will be the first toss-up seat on the Senate map to close on 2026, even before North Carolina, which is at 7:30. So Georgia, depending on how fast the results come in, may give us a sign at how the Democrats and the Republicans are doing on the election night in 2026. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. And again, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in a future video.